The backstory: Tom and Max's journey. Tom had been working in construction management for nearly a decade. It was a job that demanded long hours, tough decisions, and often left him feeling drained. The relentless pace of the projects, the constant pressure to meet deadlines, and the never-ending cycle of new challenges had worn him down over the years. He was good at what he did, respected by his peers, trusted by his superiors, but the stress had taken its toll. The only thing that kept him going was the dream of someday finding peace, a place where he could escape the noise of the city and the demands of his career. But it wasn't just work that had driven Tom to the edge. 3 years ago, he had been in a relationship with a woman named Sarah. They had met through mutual friends, and for a while, everything had seemed perfect. Sarah was kind, intelligent, and had a way of making Tom feel like he could conquer the world. They talked about the future, made plans to move in together, and even discussed marriage. But it all came crashing down when Tom discovered Sarah had been unfaithful. The betrayal cut deep. Tom had always believed in loyalty and trust, and Sarah's infidelity shattered his perception of their relationship. They tried to work things out, but the trust was gone, and eventually, they parted ways. The breakup left Tom feeling hollow, as if a part of him had been ripped away. He buried himself in work, hoping to drown out the pain, but it only made him more detached from the world around him. One night, about a year after the breakup, Tom found himself standing on the edge of a bridge, staring down at the dark waters below. He had reached a breaking point, overwhelmed by the weight of his job and the loneliness that had consumed him. The thought of ending it all seemed like the only way to find peace. But just as he was about to take that final step, he heard a noise, a faint whimper from the shadows. Curiosity got the better of him, and he turned to find a small, emaciated dog cowering under the bridge. The dog was filthy, covered in matted fur and scars, clearly a stray that had been living on the streets for some time. But there was something in the dog's eyes, a plea for help, a glimmer of hope that cut through Tom's despair. Tom hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached the dog. It didn't run away, just watched him with those pleading eyes. He knelt down, reached out his hand, and the dog tentatively sniffed it before leaning into his touch. In that moment, Tom felt a connection, a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. He couldn't leave the dog behind, not when it needed him as much as he needed it. He took the dog home, cleaned him up, and nursed him back to health. He named him Max. Over the weeks that followed, Tom and Max formed an unbreakable bond. Max became more than just a pet. He was Tom's constant companion, his confidant, and in many ways, his savior. The dog's presence helped pull Tom out of the darkness, giving him a reason to keep going, even on the toughest days. But despite Max's companionship, the weight of Tom's life still pressed down on him. The city, the job, the memories of Sarah. It all became too much. That's when Tom decided to take a break, to get away from it all and find some peace in the solitude of nature. He rented a small cabin on a remote lake, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was meant to be a place of healing, a retreat where he could clear his mind and reconnect with himself. Tom packed up his things, loaded Max into the car, and made the long drive to the cabin. As they pulled up to the isolated property, Tom felt a sense of relief. The lake was calm, the woods were quiet, and the cabin, though old and worn, had a certain charm. It was exactly what he needed. a place to escape, to breathe, to find himself again. But as Tom and Max settled into their new surroundings, they soon realized that the peaceful retreat held secrets of its own. Strange occurrences, the forest's secrets. In the beginning, Tom tried to chalk up the strange occurrences around the cabin to his overworked imagination. After all, the isolation was new to him, and the woods had a way of playing tricks on people, especially those who weren't accustomed to such deep silence. But it wasn't long before he realized that something wasn't right. It began with the small things, the unexplained movement of objects inside the cabin, like the old wooden chair by the fireplace that he would find facing the different direction each morning. Sometimes the kitchen window would be open when he was sure he had closed it the night before. Max noticed it too. The dog's once carefree demeanor shifted to one of heightened alertness. He would growl at the door in the middle of the night, his ears perked up, his body tense, as if sensing a presence just outside. The woods themselves seemed to be alive, filled with an energy that Tom couldn't quite explain. When he stepped outside in the mornings, the air felt thicker, charged with an electric tension that made his skin prickle. On his walks with Max, he often felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him, as if the trees themselves were watching his every move. He would turn suddenly, hoping to catch sight of whatever it was, but there was never anyone there, just the endless stretch of trees and shadows. Max became increasingly wary, his instincts sharper than ever. On several occasions, the dog stopped dead in his tracks, refusing to go any further along their usual trail. He would growl low in his throat, his hackles raised, as if confronting something Tom couldn't see. Once, Tom tried to push forward despite Max's hesitation, but the dog pulled at his leash, nearly dragging him back in the direction of the cabin. It was as if Max knew something Tom didn't, something lurking just out of sight, waiting for them to let their guard down. Then came the nights. The darkness in the woods seemed to carry a weight of its own, pressing down on the cabin, making the air inside stifling and oppressive. Tom would wake up in the middle of the night to strange noises, whispers that drifted through the walls, barely audible, but unmistakably real. At first, he convinced himself they were just the wind rustling through the trees, or the creaking of the old wooden beams. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if voices were speaking directly to him from the shadows. The most disturbing experience occurred one night when Tom woke to the sound of footsteps on the cabin's porch. He lay in bed, his heart pounding in his chest, as the heavy, deliberate footsteps slowly moved across the creaking wooden boards. Max was at his side, growling low in his throat, his eyes fixed on the door. Tom held his breath, waiting for the knock that never came. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. Tom rushed to the window, half expecting to see a person standing on the porch, but there was no one. The empty porch stretched out before him, bathed in the dim light of the moon. Max remained on high alert, pacing back and forth in front of the door, his growls low and constant. The experience left Tom rattled, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever or whoever had been outside was not of this world. From that point on, Tom couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The strange occurrences became more frequent, the whispers louder, the sense of being watched more intense. The peaceful escape he had sought in the cabin had turned into something else entirely. A place of unease where the boundaries between the living and the dead seemed blurred. The ghost's history, a tragic tale. The whispers, the shadows, the inexplicable happenings around the cabin, they all seemed to point to one thing: the presence of a ghost. Tom didn't believe in such things, or at least he hadn't before. But as the days passed and the strange occurrences persisted, he found himself unable to dismiss the possibility. The cabin was old, and the woods even older. It wasn't hard to imagine that the land held memories, some of which refused to fade with time. Tom's curiosity got the better of him, and he started digging into the history of the area. He asked around at the local town, hoping to find someone who knew more about the cabin and the woods surrounding it. Most people were reluctant to talk, brushing off his questions with vague answers or telling him they didn't know much about the place. But after a few days of persistent questioning, he finally found an old man in the town's general store who seemed willing to share the story. The man's name was Hank, and he had lived in the area his entire life. He was in his late 70s, with a weathered face and a slow, deliberate way of speaking that made every word feel significant. When Tom mentioned the strange occurrences at the cabin, Hank nodded knowingly, as if he had heard it all before. "That place has always been different," Hank said, his voice low and gravelly. "People say the woods are haunted. Some won't even go near 'em after dark. Can't say I blame 'em." Tom pressed him for details, and slowly, Hank began to unravel the tale. The ghost, Hank explained, was believed to be the spirit of a man named Jacob Harper. Jacob had lived in the area over a century ago, back when the land was still being settled. He was a recluse, keeping mostly to himself in a small cabin deeper in the woods, far from where Tom's cabin now stood. Jacob had always been a bit of an outsider, a man with a tragic past that few knew about. According to local legend, Jacob had lost everything in a devastating fire that had swept through the woods one summer. The fire had started from a lightning strike during a fierce storm, quickly spreading through the dry brush and engulfing everything in its path. Jacob's cabin had been in the heart of the inferno, and though the townsfolk tried to help, they couldn't reach him in time. But the fire hadn't just taken Jacob's home. It had taken his family as well. His wife and young daughter had been inside the cabin when the flames consumed it. The story went that Jacob had tried to save them, running into the burning building, but the smoke and heat were too much. He had perished alongside them, his charred body found clinging to the remains of the cabin. Some said that Jacob's spirit couldn't move on because of the guilt he felt for not being able to save his family. Others believed that his anger at the townsfolk for not rescuing them in time kept him tethered to the land. Whatever the reason, Jacob's ghost was said to haunt the woods, luring those who ventured too close to their doom. Over the years, there had been numerous reports of people getting lost in the woods, never to be seen again. The locals believed it was Jacob's doing, his restless spirit leading them astray. Hank warned Tom to be careful, to stay away from the deeper parts of the woods where Jacob's cabin had once stood. But the old man's warning only piqued Tom's curiosity further. He couldn't help but wonder if the ghost of Jacob Harper was responsible for the strange occurrences around his own cabin. The more Tom thought about it, the more he became convinced that Jacob's spirit was still lingering, still searching for something or someone. The whispers, the footsteps, the shadows, they all seemed to be guiding him toward something. But what? Climax. The encounter. One evening, unable to resist the pull any longer, Tom decided to venture deeper into the woods. Max was reluctant, growling and tugging at his leash, but Tom pressed on, determined to find the source of the disturbances. The forest grew denser as they moved further away from the cabin, the trees closing in around them, their branches intertwining like the fingers of a dark, ancient hand. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thick, the light dimmer, as if the forest itself were closing in on them. Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he pushed the feeling aside, determined to uncover the truth. After what felt like hours of walking, Tom came upon a small clearing. The ground was charred and barren, the trees surrounding it blackened and twisted as if they had been burned long ago. In the center of the clearing stood the remnants of an old cabin, little more than a pile of ash and half-buried timbers. It was then that Tom saw him, Jacob. The ghost stood at the edge of the clearing, his figure barely visible in the dim light. He was exactly as the townsfolk had described, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a face twisted in pain. His clothes were charred, his skin scarred from the fire that had claimed his life. But it was his eyes that held Tom's attention. Cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through him, seeing everything yet revealing nothing. For a moment, Tom couldn't move, couldn't speak. He was frozen in place, staring at the ghostly figure before him. Max stood beside him, growling low in his throat, his body rigid with fear. But the dog didn't move either, as if he too was held in place by the apparition's presence. Jacob didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. The whispers in Tom's mind grew louder, more urgent, as if they were trying to tell him something. But he couldn't make out the words, only the feeling of overwhelming sorrow, of loss, of guilt. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Jacob turned and walked into the trees. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. Tom stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what to do, before finally turning back at the way he had come. Max followed close behind, no longer growling, but still alert, his eyes constantly scanning the woods. They walked in silence, the weight of the encounter heavy on their minds. When they finally reached the cabin, Tom felt a strange sense of relief, as if he had narrowly escaped something terrible. But he knew that the ghost was still out there, watching, waiting for the next time someone ventured too far into the woods. Aftermath, the lingering presence. The days that followed the encounter were marked by a profound silence that seemed to envelop the entire cabin. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air, as though the very fabric of reality had been altered by his confrontation with Jacob's ghost. The oppressive atmosphere that had once suffocated him had lightened, but only just. It was as if the cabin and the surrounding woods had taken a deep breath, temporarily releasing the tension, but not completely exhaling the malevolent presence that lingered. Tom's routine became more cautious. He no longer ventured deep into the woods, and his walks with Max became shorter, sticking to the well-worn paths closer to the cabin. Max, too, seemed to sense the subtle change. The dog, once carefree and playful, had become ever watchful, his ears constantly perked up, his eyes scanning the tree line as if anticipating something, someone lurking just out of sight. Despite the eerie quiet that had settled over the place, Tom couldn't bring himself to leave. There was a strange pull that kept him there, an inexplicable attachment to the cabin and the lake. Perhaps it was the sense of unfinished business, the feeling that Jacob's story wasn't fully told. Or maybe it was the peace that came from knowing he had faced his fears, even if they had taken the form of a ghostly figure from the past. During the day, Tom tried to lose himself in work. The projects that had once consumed his every waking thought seemed distant now, like a different life altogether. But he forced himself to stay busy, fixing up the cabin, organizing his paperwork, and even taking on small freelance tasks remotely. Yet, no matter how much he tried to immerse himself in the mundane tasks, his mind kept drifting back to that night in the woods, replaying the encounter over and over in his head. The nights, however, were different. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, Tom felt the cabin come alive with an unsettling energy. The whispers returned, sometimes so faint that he could barely hear them, other times so clear that they seemed to be spoken right into his ear. He would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the disembodied voices that seemed to drift through the walls. They never formed coherent sentences, just fragments of thoughts, broken words, and mournful sighs. And then there were the dreams. Tom began having vivid, almost lucid dreams of the fire that had consumed Jacob's life. He saw the flames rising, felt the heat on his skin, heard the desperate cries of Jacob's wife and daughter trapped inside the burning cabin. But the most disturbing part was that, in these dreams, Tom wasn't just an observer. He was Jacob. He could feel the man's anguish, his guilt, his desperation as he tried to reach his family, only to be consumed by the flames himself. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, the smell of smoke lingering in his nostrils long after the dream had faded. The line between dream and reality began to blur. Tom found himself questioning whether the ghostly encounters were just figments of his imagination, a manifestation of his guilt and unresolved grief. He couldn't deny that Jacob's story had touched a nerve, mirroring his own feelings of loss and failure. The betrayal by Sarah, the crushing weight of his job, the near-suicidal despair. Tom realized that he too had been haunted long before he ever set foot in that cabin. The difference was his ghosts were metaphorical, born of past mistakes and regrets. But Jacob's ghost was real, tangible, a reminder that some wounds never heal, even in death. Max seemed to sense Tom's turmoil. The dog had always been intuitive, picking up on his moods and offering comfort in the way only a dog could. But now, Max was more than just a companion. He was a guardian, always at Tom's side, his presence a steadying force amid the chaos that had become Tom's mind. There were nights when Tom would wake from a nightmare, his breath coming in ragged gasps, only to find Max lying beside him, his warm body pressed against Tom's side, grounding him in reality. Despite Max's comforting presence, the cabin never felt entirely safe. There were moments when Tom would catch movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow flitting across the wall, a figure standing just beyond the window, only to disappear when he looked directly at it. Sometimes he would hear the sound of footsteps on the porch again, just as he had that first night, slow and deliberate. But when he opened the door, there was nothing but empty space. The strangest thing of all was that despite the fear and the unease, Tom felt a strange sense of connection to the place. It was as if the cabin had become a part of him, or perhaps he had become a part of it. He found himself talking to Jacob in the quiet moments when the whispers had faded and the shadows were still. He would sit on the porch, Max at his feet, staring out at the lake, and speak aloud, as if Jacob could hear him. "I'm sorry," Tom would say, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. Was it for disturbing Jacob's peace, for not being able to help him? Or was it an apology to himself for the years of guilt and regret he had carried? He wasn't sure, but the words felt right, even if they were met with silence. The locals in town noticed a change in Tom when he came in for supplies. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes following him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Some whispered that he had been touched by the ghost, that Jacob had chosen him for some unknown purpose. Others said he was simply losing his mind, driven mad by the isolation and the haunting. Tom didn't care what they thought. He had faced something out in those woods that few people could understand, and it had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. As the weeks passed, Tom began to wonder if he was meant to stay at the cabin forever. The thought scared him, but it also brought a strange sense of comfort. There was a peace in the solitude, a quiet acceptance of the things that couldn't be changed. The ghost of Jacob Harper still lingered, but it no longer felt like a threat. It was simply a presence, a part of the land, just as Tom had become. One evening, as the sun set and the woods were bathed in a deep orange glow, Tom sat on the porch with Max, watching the light fade into darkness. He felt a sense of calm that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The whispers were there, faint but familiar, like the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. The shadows moved, but they no longer frightened him. They were just part of the landscape now, like the trees and the lake and the stars that began to twinkle in the sky above. Tom knew he couldn't stay at the cabin forever. Eventually, he would have to return to the world, to face the life he had left behind. But for now, he was content to remain in this in-between space, where the living and the dead coexisted in uneasy harmony. The cabin had become his refuge, and in a strange way, Jacob had become a companion of sorts, a reminder of the things that bound them together, both in life and in death. Max nudged Tom's hand with his nose, and Tom smiled, scratching the dog behind the ears. He looked out at the lake, now a mirror of the starry sky above, and felt a sense of peace. Whatever came next, he knew he could face it. He wasn't alone, not anymore.